Roughly 20%, that's 1 out of 5 Americans, do not know or do not think that atheists are protected under the Constitution. These are among the findings of a new study by the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg Public Policy Center, and we're going to talk more about that in a few moments. Ed Golly with Jim Young, Joe Reinhardt, and Jim Peterson here in the Tam Talk studio, where you can offer up your opinion on the program today by picking up the phone and dialing 441-3000. Well, first of all, Joe Reinhardt, can you report on any progress from the East Wing by our first Gold Digger-in-Chief's effort to address cyberbullying here in America?
Well, yes, Ed, I can report, but I can't report on any progress, since that would require some progress. But Melania has been in the press, particularly the last few days, for having Twittered herself into a corner. She sent a tweet over Thanksgiving that said, we give thanks, and let's keep those who can't be with their families in our thoughts today. And of course, the Twitterverse immediately filled up with responses to that, pointing out that there were at least 5,000 troops down at the border of Mexico who were there for no other reason than a political stunt, who wouldn't be with their families and would be enjoying military Thanksgiving feed. Looks and tastes like real food. So
served on plastic plates with plastic china,
yeah.
styrofoam cups.
As long as it's disposable, it's quite okay. In any case, nothing to report, no progress in the anti-bullying field, other than the bullier-in-chief has been very active. But Melania, at least her thoughts and prayers go out to those that their lives are being made worse as a direct result of her husband.
Well, such things, of course, do summon thoughts of real turkey just for this occasion.
The survey we were talking about was released ahead of the September 17th Constitution Day, which celebrates the anniversary of the U.S. Constitution signing in 1787, and it asked respondents whether they thought it was accurate to say that U.S. citizens who are Muslims have the same rights as all other citizens. 66% of those surveyed said it was very accurate or somewhat accurate, while 18% said it was very or somewhat inaccurate. 4% didn't know.
I would like to ask those people who think that atheists and Muslims or other individuals that they don't particularly care for are not protected by the Constitution, and since they're unprotected, what exactly can you do, and what do you want to do to people who are unprotected?
Yeah, do you take away their right to vote?
No,
Or
do you show them the business end of a Louisville Slugger?
Yeah.
Well, we're talking about Christians here now. I'm not talking about the victims of this prejudice, but we're talking about the people perhaps who are willing to wield this Louisville Slugger. Now, I have long been entertained by Christians who claim to have a superior moral and ethical standard, and yet I, an atheist who is supposed to be morally corrupt because I don't believe in a supreme being, am amazed at the behavior of these people who claim to have this superior morality. And I watch their behavior. Now this, for the last couple of years especially, we've been treated to a display almost daily of events that have headlined, underlined, underscored, emphasized just exactly what is the standard of integrity of the Christian community, because this administration, this Congress, is made up of the party of God in America, the Christian party of God, overwhelmingly. And on election day, such as we had on November 6th, they come out in droves and flock to support their fascist politicians with their vote for a variety of reasons, and it escapes me how that they can even claim any morality or ethical standard when you observe what their agenda is and their behavior is. So I'd like to just review a few of the things that I've observed and that essentially expose the true moral and ethical bankruptcy of the Christian community, and by extension, the Christian religion itself, because as the Bible teaches, as Jesus in the Bible proclaimed, you can know a tree by the fruit that it bears. Okay? So if Christianity is a moral and ethical religion and it is superior, we should expect to see that reflected in the actions of its followers, its believers. And I think that we see its standard reflected in those actions. I think that when you observe the fruit, you know the tree. Now, what am I referring to? We'll start out by saying Christians who support lies and spread lies about an immigrant caravan supposedly invading the United States. And they do this with a view to whip up voter outrage and fear just prior to the midterm election.
I just want to interject one brief point, and that is, I don't want to paint all Christians with too broad a brush. There are some very fine people who are so close to being true humanists that they're really to be admired. But one thing that the Trump dynasty has done is to bring out the flaws, the hypocrisy in what amounts to a significant number of believers and a significant number of devout believers who follow Trump in spite of the fact that on any given afternoon he's subject to break at least 8 or 9 of the 10 Commandments.
Well, since the party of God is composed of about 90% proclaimed Christians, fundamentalist Christians.
Yeah, certainly the Congress and the Senate on the Republican side is 100% Christian, or maybe with 1 or 2 exceptions, but very few of those have gotten out of their seat to put up their hand and say, wait a minute, this is not what the way we want to be thought of and the way we should behave. We haven't heard much from them.
I don't know the exact number of Christians who voted for the fascist conservative party of God.
82% of the evangelicals.
Okay, so I may not have been talking about 18%.
But another important point is to remember that while many critical thinkers believe that the current administration does in fact verge on the edge, in fact having gone over the edge of fascism in terms of its policies, its outlook, its political beliefs, and so forth, they do not proclaim it to be such outright. They don't call their policies fascist. However, and a lot of people can be deceived when they're told that these proposals are true blue American and that these things are happening. Our president is most notable for the fact that he lies fairly regularly and constantly. Over 6,000 fact-checked prevarications in his record so far that have been summarized by the press at this point. So a lot of people can be forgiven if they think that they're voting for 100% Americanism when they're actually voting for proposals and ways of life suggested that are more reflective of fascist Germany or Italy.
Well, I realize we don't want to be unfair, and there's Christians, probably the very Christians that I'm referring to, will be offended that I point out their hypocrisy or hypocrisy. But and object to being referred to as fascists, or be offended that I say that they are morally and ethically bankrupt. But when I tune in to television or to radio, and for example, in Tampa, you can tune into WFLA and listen to Jack Harris vilify liberals and Democrats 24/7. I think to myself, well, if they can do that to us, and then they have no standing to protest if we call them out for their hate and their bigotry and their offensive lies about the atheist and the liberal community and Democrats.
Right.
I have found by listening to people like Jack Harris on WFLA and all of these people in Fox News, that Christians are essentially pathological liars about everything, and they are so because they have a view to deny others the ability to make an informed decision.
The minute you sign up to be a Christian, in other words, the minute you convert, you are signing on to a lie. You are promising to pretend to believe and to know things that can't possibly be known. So a moral system built on a lie is sort of like a house built on sand. And since in order to remain a believer, you have to continue to pretend to believe the unbelievable, and lying becomes second nature to you. You're required to do it in order to keep your social, economic, and political standing. You have no choice.
And I also note that their rhetoric is filled with dehumanizing terms designed to vilify and ostracize people whom they don't like. So with that much emphasis on hate and the nurturing of hate, I don't think it says much on the positive side about Christian values. In fact, I think that it basically suggests that they are without values.
Well, if you're part of the group, things aren't too bad. Religion, if you're part of the group and you look around at everybody that looks and thinks and acts like you do, and you begin to think, well, this is the way it ought to be on a global scale, and you don't realize that no matter how large your religion is, you're still a minority on a global scale. And once you get outside the group and are competing or weighing the values of other religions, religion at that point becomes extremely divisive. So it's sort of like a mirage. It looks like all friendship and love and companionship and oneness until you realize that only applies to the people who are part of the club. And if you're not in the club, then you need to be dealt with.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a video that was recently disseminated by the White House. It was a doctored video, essentially designed to peddle fake news and make false accusations against a journalist. This done by the Party of God. And of course, it was cheered on by Fox News and Breitbart News and all of these other Party of God propaganda outlets. So when it comes, they don't seem to have any qualms at all about lying. And I think
as I
that
say, they're required to lie to be part of the group.
Well, most people, I think, are brought up, who are in the group, were brought up in the group. They were
Yes.
born into
Right.
it. And so therefore, they would be
Let's
highly
just-
disposed not to question anything.
Well, let's just say
But-
they're sincerely mistaken.
Yes, but when they do begin to question it, then as Lincoln observed, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And their house, the one they were born into, cannot stand. And that's how people come to different opinions, shall we say.
And I am shocked at the Christian community's sympathies with neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups, organizations of hate, all the while denying that they are racist. And you go to these Party of God rallies, you see white faces, very few faces of color. And I just have to conclude, why would anyone of color want to be associated with this group at all? I mean, it's obvious they don't care about you. And when it's time to try to disenfranchise and prevent someone from voting, who do the Party of God Christians target?
Minorities?
Minorities, people of color, Hispanic communities.
And these are people who are ahistorical. They don't know about what happened before, because in the latter part of the 19th century, and the beginning of the 20th, you had a whole movement. It's called eugenics, and it enlisted the willing participation of some of the highest levels of intellectual life in the United States, and were deeply influential. In fact, Hitler himself credited his own outlook and belief system largely to two Americans, one of whom was Chamberlain. I forget the other guy, but they were writers of books that defended the whole notion of racism, racial
Wasn't Chamberlain a
supremacy.
limey? I mean, England. He
No,
was.
No, we're
Neville
talking. Not talking about.
We'll make that clear then.
Neville.
Yeah, we're talking. No, we're not talking about Neville Chamberlain.
All
We're
right.
talking about another a U.S. person.
Wilt Chamberlain.
Yeah, no, not that one. Not Chamberlain.
And of course, in
But
this,
anyway, you
in
get my drift.
I'm just guessing.
In the
Yeah.
midterm elections, we saw the Christian community overwhelmingly supporting these politicians who enacted legislation specifically designed to make it impossible for Native Americans to living on a reservation in North Dakota to have access to the ballot box.
But you know, Jim, the Republican and conservative politicians did not initially support Trump, but they understood that they had to fall in line once he took over the party, right? And if they want to keep their jobs, they've got to support him.
So in essence, their standard of ethics is so strong they were
Just
willing
where I
to
was
sell
going.
their soul to the devil for power.
They might even be willing to ignore the murder of a journalist in exchange for some
I don't think they go that far.
some revenue for arms sales or things like
Well,
that.
of course they are supporting the murder of this journalist. They're not out protesting, demanding justice for this Muslim who was murdered in the Saudi Arabian embassy.
You know, we have traditionally demanded of the Muslim community that they prove their bona fides by asking their leaders to come out strongly against
Terrorism or
yes, terrorism and extremism of various kinds. And it seems to me that Christians are doing the same thing. They need to ask their leaders, because it's the fault of their leaders, who apparently know nothing about history, who see nothing being repeated here that was part of what precipitated World War II. The same sort of thoughts and ideology and movements that were then are coming on strong now. And of course, young people especially, who don't know anything about history, are deeply affected by something that was here once before. And if they knew about that, what the outcome of it was, then perhaps they might not be so enthusiastic.
Well, we're supposedly appalled at dictators such as the one in Venezuela, President Maduro, who oppresses his people to stay in power, and people like Ortega in Nicaragua, Kim Jong-un in North Korea. But what do we do in this country? What are the Christians, the Party of God, doing in the United States of America to the people who are supposed to have government of the people, by the people, for the people, but instead they are oppressed because these Christians employ every tactic they can to make it hard for people like students, minorities, and the poor to cast a ballot at the ballot box. They literally defraud Americans of their right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And they have, there's no accountability because the party of God is in control of everything.
Yes, it is rather surprising and disappointing, but there's a considerable lag time, it seems. After World War II, in the immediate years thereafter, it was revealed what had happened in Germany in terms of the concentration camps. Millions of people murdered very cruelly during the course of the war, and yet in the United States, official anti-Semitism persisted for 10 years longer. Even by people who knew what happened in those places, to Jewish people continued to exercise anti-Semitic beliefs and
What makes you think
laws.
it went away after that? Perhaps you haven't
Oh,
heard
it's still,
the,
yeah.
you haven't heard the tapes of Richard Nixon and Billy Graham talking about how the Jews run everything.
Right, yes. It did persist,
Yeah.
but at least at a lower level. It wasn't the official policy of the government at that point.
You're listening to the Atheist Forum here on the Tan Talk
Yes, it
Radio
was.
Network, and we'd surely invite your participation by simply picking up the phone and calling 441-3000, and you can tell these atheists why they have no idea what they're thinking about and why it's right. Anyway, we want to take just a quick break, tell you about Atheists of Florida, which is the organization that puts this program on, then back with more talk here on the Atheist Forum. Atheists of Florida is a nonprofit membership organization founded in 1992. For over 25 years, Atheists of Florida has brought atheists together to address state-church separation issues, provide legal assistance in cases of religious discrimination in employment or educational institutions, help atheists meet others who want to live their lives free of religion, and produce the Atheist Forum. For membership information, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com, where you'll find our newsletters, annual reports, statement of purpose, and information about meetings and events. That's atheistofflorida.com. And golly, with the usual suspects, Jim Peterson, Joe Reinhardt, and Jim Young here in the Tan Talk Radio Network studio. And Joe, you have our quote for the week, I believe.
Well, Ed, by some strange coincidence, I do. It's this week is a quote from the Humanist Manifesto. There have been several Humanist Manifestos. This is from the Humanist Manifesto 2000. That's from the year 2000, not the number 2000. Humanists everywhere have defended the separation of church and state. We believe that the state should be secular, neither for nor against religion. We thus reject theocracies that seek to impose one moral or religious code on everyone.
Well, Donald Trump's principal advisor in the West Wing is his daughter, Ivanka Trump. It's miraculous that out of millions of Americans, she got tapped for it. But that's just the way it worked out. She is his senior political advisor, eminently qualified by her ability to design dresses, to know about world financial affairs, history, political events all over the world. And other than her advice to him to remain or keep the United States in the Paris Climate Accords, which he rejected, we wondered what other advice she's given him, because we've never really heard anything about it. So we put Jim to work and asked him to look up a few things and see if he could find out anything else that she's advised him on, and we came up with a few items. She advised him what color necktie to wear to the Veterans Day memorial events. Clearly qualified to do that. She advised him what brand of coffee should be served with dessert in the White House. And she advised him, beyond all other things, do not, I repeat, do not prosecute Hillary Clinton for using a private email server. Because of course we've lately found out that she's done the exact same thing herself. So when we talk about hypocrisy, again, the word is inadequate to describe what the conservatives are doing. It's hyperocracy. Hyperocracy. Not only from the politicians and the candidates themselves, but also from those who vote for them. They're the people that want to tell you and me what morality is and how it should be legislated to control our lives, and yet they seem to have a total indifference to the morality of the people they elect to mislead our nation, whether it's on a statewide level, our governor, who is an absolute criminal who should spend the rest of his life in jail for the several $100 million that he stole from Medicare because he cares so much about Florida's families, and sought power in the governor's mansion only to enrich himself, all the way up to the office of the presidency, where we see the exact same thing happening. The way I figure it, Joe, if he spent $64 million to buy the Senate seat, he probably can figure he'll recover that roughly in the first year and then have 5 more years of net profit.
He probably knows what his hourly rate is.
Yeah, so he'll come out about $500 million ahead by the end of his term, while meanwhile our environment is trashed, our public school system is decimated, and of course our transportation system remains roughly around the middle of the 20th century.
And speaking of the wall of separation of church and state, the Party of God, who is in power in Congress, has recently passed legislation designed to institutionalize churches as political propaganda machines, in total violation of the separation clause in the Constitution.
More on that, the propaganda machines, the churches as propaganda machines.
And of course, the airwaves are constantly filled with Christian rhetoric, fanning the flames of hate for Hispanics and Muslims and African Americans, the LGBTQ community, liberals, women, especially women who fight for women's rights, atheists, anyone who doesn't agree with their theocratic agenda.
It's almost a blessing that a big percentage of them don't do any of that. All they want you to do is send them as much money as you can possibly beg, borrow, or steal.
Indeed, we are blessed.
So I mean, the prosperity gospels, who in my estimation are some of the biggest scum ever to trod the face of the earth, when you compare them to their more self-righteous brethren, come off looking almost halfway decent.
Well, I'm very concerned as an American because these Christian fascists have succeeded in stacking the courts of America with jurists who will defend right-wing fascist ideology instead of the Constitution they are sworn to uphold. And they ignore human rights and the rule of law. All of this calls into question their integrity, their morality, and their ethics. And I'm afraid the camel's back is about to break from the weight of all of this evil, if I may be so bold as to refer to it. These same individuals want to criminalize. They have tried in the past. They may yet succeed. They want to criminalize any criticism of religion. So people like me might be in the future one day accused of blasphemy and imprisoned right here in the United States of America. We know in Islamic countries that very thing occurs, and people may actually be put to death just for saying something, expressing a point of view that is counter to the religious community. And there are many, many fascist Christians right here in the United States of America who want to institutionalize the very same kinds of laws. And if you look in your Bible and you study the Old Testament law, blasphemy was a crime.
The only sin for which you cannot be forgiven is to blaspheme the Holy Ghost. So clearly, blasphemy in that instance would be the worst possible sin you could commit. If
Well-
you make fun of Casper the Holy Ghost, you're in big trouble.
Yeah, you say the only sin you can't be forgiven, but Christians have a problem forgiving any sin,
Well, yeah, but the Almighty is the forgiver in chief.
especially if that sin is committed by a Democrat or a liberal or an atheist.
Right.
It's a lot
Nothing
more.
escapes their purview.
That's right. It's a lot more obvious, I think.
Yeah.
An atheist does it.
I wish this list did not go on and on, but unfortunately, it does. Christians supported those politicians who kidnapped children and babies from immigrants legally seeking asylum at the border. And when these children were kidnapped, no records were kept to be able to return these children to their parents at a later date. Clearly, the Christians who kidnapped these children had no intention of ever returning them. And yet these people who they stole the children from were not committing a crime. It is not a crime to seek asylum at the United States border. Anyone can seek asylum. You may not be granted that asylum until after a hearing and investigation, but you are not a criminal just because you show up at the border and ask for asylum.
And this is true not just as a matter of law, but it's built into the Constitution itself.
And yet there is no outrage from the Christian community. Where is the outrage?
It's same place as the Muslim outrage that they keep bitching about we don't hear enough about after every Islamic terrorist event. I want to say this too, and that has to do with the taking of infant and small children from their parents. The Party of God, as Jim calls them, or the Republicans as they're now known, went right on doing this. In fact, they were just as eager to do it after it was very plainly explained to them that it wasn't just a matter of inconvenience or a temporary problem, but that children could be traumatized for decades, if not their whole lives, from being separated from and being held captive in cages by strangers, many of whom might not have been too friendly. And I don't have any firsthand knowledge, but every time you have children unprotected, you have child abuse. So God knows how many of them might have been subjected to all kinds of physical or sexual
Certainly psychological
and
abuse.
psychological things, again, that would traumatize them for the rest of their lives. Once that was explained to the Republicans, they didn't let up a bit, never slowed down.
I ate breakfast in a Waffle House the other day, and as a course of the conversation with the waitress, I asked her, how much do you make an hour? She said $5.23 an hour, plus tips. And I said, well, if you count in all of your tips, how do you make out? Well, approximately about minimum wage, sometimes less than
$10
minimum
an hour
wage.
in this state.
Well, $8.
Yeah, excuse me. Right.
Yes, in the state of Florida here. And I said $8 an hour. So there's 2,080 hours in a year. So your gross for the year is about $16,000. I guess it's kind of tough to pay for rent and food and clothing. By the way, you have to also pay for your Social Security and Medicare. These come off the top before you get your paycheck. Who is responsible for that? The Christian community is responsible. They have to take responsibility. The party of God is the party that does not want the poor to make a livable wage. They want to be able to pay slave wages.
Yeah, they're vigorously anti-union as well.
Yes. Now, when these
Well,
people
actually-
struggle and have to have food stamps or some kind of assistance, What kind of rhetoric do you hear from the Christian community? These people are lazy. They wouldn't work if you gave them a job. It's their fault they don't have an education.
They come to get their food stamps in a Cadillac.
Yes.
Interestingly, though, many of these same people in the party of God are in fact working class people, people with the same problems, and what they're advocating and what they're defending are actually the policies of the class of people who are the bosses, the investors, the CEOs, and so forth, who are the true beneficiaries of most of these policies.
They're happy
The
to give
reason-
up prosperity as long as they don't have to give up their chance.
Oh, that's right.
at being-
Well, they're giving up their chance of happiness, the pursuit of happiness in this life, because they're promised the pursuit of happiness in a life that they,
Plus, someday they might become the boss.
who knows?
Yeah.
I find it extraordinarily amazing that people are willing to follow and serve their slave masters so eagerly. But yet we know that religion was used as a mechanism to enslave people. It has always been used.
Yes.
Karl Marx knew that, Lenin knew that, Stalin, all these. Preachers know that, politicians know that. They use religion. Once you get enslaved by religion, that's all that counts. We know that the African American community was brought over here in chains to work as slaves. Then they were given religion. We don't need the chains anymore.
That's right.
So a lot of these people are members of the party of God and will vote with them, because even though the party of God enslaves them economically.
Some of the early efforts of missionaries involved coming into a camp or a large collection of say in Africa, of natives, who hadn't been exposed to civilization. And they'd grab 3 or 4 people and they'd cut off their hands so that they just dangled by shards of flesh, and then said, anybody else that, in favor of this, stand over here, and anybody who wants to be a Christian, stand over here. And the crowd on this side got to be pretty good. So,
Yeah, well, I think that when Moses came down off of the mountain with the 10 Commandments, he basically instituted monotheism at the point of a sword.
the first thing the Levites did was kill, was it 5,000 of their brothers?
Several thousand
Yeah.
throughout the camp. That was the order, go kill everybody that doesn't get on our bandwagon.
Yeah.
It turns out that the road to what we call civilization has been long and painful for the overwhelming majority of human beings who have ever lived.
Right.
And this pattern of behavior repeats over and over and over again. And as Santayana once observed, the great philosopher, those who do not learn from history are obliged to repeat it. So
Well,
this is something that we can do something about. I mean, we have schools that teach history, world history, U.S. history, just an understanding of who people are, how they operate, their psychology, and the sociology that makes us human. That is something that can give us the insight we need to overcome these patterns. We don't have to behave this way politically or in any other way. So I think that's the big task, and it's not just for those of us sitting in this radio station, but for those of you out there, you care about these issues, and it's up to you to make a difference. Attend your Board of Education meetings. Beware of who's running for office
It would,
in all cases.
it would be much easier, I think, for us to breed and have a society along the lines that you said that is more tolerant, forgiving, and so on, if it weren't for the fact that we are conditioned by Christianity to punish anyone who doesn't agree with us on the subject of religion, and by extension on any other subject. If I can punish someone for all eternity, or if that's what the deity does for what amounts to a difference of opinion, why should I be any different than that? And so it shows, it breeds, is a moral foundation that dictates that people can be punished, not just for what they do, which is certainly plenty of good reason, no matter what it is they do, but you can punish them for what they think. So when we have a society where the whole moral system is founded on the idea of punishment, well, what do you get?
Punishment.
Speaking of the subject of education, when I was in junior high school, there was a lot of emphasis placed on a course called Problems in American Democracy, learning about how democracies function, our democracy compared to countries like China and the Soviet Union. One of the things that I learned about was how the state controlled the media, and the people in the Soviet Union, for example, were subjected to 24/7 propaganda, and voices in opposition
And
to
we
that
aren't.
were silenced. Today, I'm shocked to have to acknowledge we have not necessarily a state-controlled media, but a media controlled by the party of God, 24/7. And any other broadcasting media that is not a follower of the party of God is vilified as the enemy of the people. And any objective reporting is referred to as fake news. And the news emanating from the party of God's favorite broadcasting network, Fox News, is in reality fake news. Most of it is spin, and of course they refer to it as fair and balanced, but nothing could be further from the truth.
Propaganda by any other name.
And it is hosted by a legion of fascist propagandists, pundits, the likes of, well, Bill O'Reilly, Glenn Beck, and you know the names, Laura Ingraham.
The amazing thing is that the guy who complains the loudest about so-called fake news is the world's most preeminent purveyor of same, who rigged up the fake Time magazine news covers to announcements that thousands of Muslims were cheering on the day that the World Trade Centers came down from the rooftops of New Jersey, and that there's all kinds of election fraud. Yeah, exactly. Calling up, planning fake stories. You know, it may take one to know one, but at the same time, he never offers one single iota of evidence for any reports from the legitimate news media, whether it's the New York Times or CNN or Time Magazine, that's an actual, what he would call a fake story. There's never a single shred of evidence, just the same as he can't provide any evidence of any voter fraud, but he proclaims it. So why is it that those who support this guy accept that? Why don't they call him to the carpet the way the rest of us do? He ignores us, but his own supporters never call him to the carpet, never ask him to provide any evidence.
It's only the evidence of their low standard of ethics, because the party of God demands a super high standard of ethical behavior of Democrats, while insisting upon the lowest possible ethical standard, or none at all, for themselves. And you see it over and over again.
This week's example, of course, is the email issue with Ivanka and Hillary, right? Hillary should be locked up for using a private server,
Yeah, it's nothing.
but when Ivanka does it, we don't even talk about it.
Well, these same Christians want the investigation and prosecution of corrupt politicians to go nowhere. That's exactly what we have seen for the last 2 years in the party of God, the Congress of the United States, controlled totally by the party of God. They want no investigation or prosecution of corruption to go anywhere.
With the exception of Mueller, whom they can't control, who has actually indicted several people.
Well, Jim Peterson, we are all familiar with the national deficit or the national debt clock in New York. It used to be in Times Square and they got moved, but it's still counting down all the time. It's time for us to erect a national clock that keeps track of Donald Trump's lies.
I'm
that
not
would be
sure that-
constantly ticking up.
I'm not sure that clock can go fast enough at this point. It's been documented by PolitiFact and others that that our erstwhile leader has issued over 6,500 lies, pure lies. If lies counted as evidence, then the man is full of evidence. Or he's full of something at any rate, but. It's rather it is rather appalling, but the people who get called out for being fake news and the enemy of the people are the people who are criticizing him for saying these things, when those things can be so easily checked.
That's
Into
the-
commonplace knowledge.
It's one of the number one tools of the hypocrites, and that is whatever disaster they're involved in is to point the finger at the Democrats or their opponents or their critics and accuse them of the same thing.
Well, they're still blaming Obama and Hillary for everything that goes wrong. This latest thing with the stock market correction, I'm sure, is Obama's fault in their opinion, in their allegations. And it's easy for somebody to get misled here. I want to clarify one thing. The points that I'm making here are not really about politics. My criticism here today is about the ethical and the moral and ethical bankruptcy of the Christian religion.
Mm-hmm.
When you can nurture and inspire this much corruption and hypocrisy and evil in over millions of voters.
I think any Christian can explain to you that it's perfectly okay, according to the Bible, to lie as long as you don't bear false witness. Ten Commandments doesn't say a word about lying. It says, "Thou shalt not bear false witness
Against your neighbor.
against your neighbor," which means you can you can lie about anybody you want to.
As long as he's not your neighbor.
Yeah, just to be on the safe side.
And of course, we can define neighbor in such narrow terms that nobody is our neighbor.
Well, I think
And that's the truth.
Well,
you are on the right track, Jim, because unless we do revive some sense of personal morality and responsibility and fealty to the truth. I mean, that's the ultimate in public morality, because truth is, in the last case, it's always public.
No
it's
truth
always
ever needed a lie.
Well,
That's right.
who throws around the
Yes.
word truth more than any other group?
people who are lying.
The party of the people, the party of God. They throw that word around.
That's right.
It's
Yeah.
meaningless in their hands because the truth is actually BS. It's all lies.
And it's particularly revelatory that it's talked about as the truth.
Yes.
Or a truth. When in fact, truth is simply a measure of veracity. It's simply making an assertion, and it's either true, false, or nonsensical. Those are the three possible categories into which any sentence has to fall.
Just shows how out of touch with current reality you are, Mr. Peterson,
Yes,
because now we
I'm
have
afraid so.
alternative facts, right?
Yes.
Facts that aren't facts, but are considered facts simply by decree.
That's why we have alternative truths.
Yes.
Yeah, there's another word that's just is abused as
I
truth,
think
and
you're
that's the word love. To the Christian, it's just a word, okay, that you throw around to try to give yourself credibility,
Leverage.
leverage,
I love you, therefore you owe me.
right?
Big time. Okay.
But also, the God who smites you with a hurricane is the God
Who loves you.
loves you.
He loves you. He's going to
Mhm.
torture you for eternity, Jim,
For
in
the
a
slightest
lake of fire
malfeasance.
because he loves you.
That's right.
It's called
That's an
tough
example.
love.
That's
Very
an example
tough.
of his
Painful,
infinite
too.
mercy.
Okay, so we're winding down,
Yes.
but I did want to make that point
We're
that,
just getting revved up.
yeah, I could go on. Actually, I've got a lot more
Time for
material.
one fist fight.
But I've made a reasonable case. All you have to do is pay attention to what Christians are doing.
Mhm.
And the tree is known by its fruit. I mean, I don't agree with a lot of things that are in the Bible, but if it's true, if you observe that this is true, you can observe someone's behavior and get a pretty good idea of what's behind it, what kind of integrity they have or don't.
The acorn does not fall far from the tree.
It does not.
Nor do the tangerines.
Pick a seat you like.
So I don't know how many people out there will actually entertain, especially in the Christian community, what we've had to say here today, but I would hope that nevertheless, people who are on the fence would think twice before becoming a Christian or any other religion, because it's not just unique with the Christian religion. Theists have a problem with ethics and morality.
And don't think once, don't think twice, think continuously. Because the world is going to be after
Time's
you.
up. Join us again next week for another episode of the Forum. And remember, if the story seems a little too implausible to be true, don't believe it just because somebody wrote it down.
Make them prove it.
Atheist Forum. To learn more about Atheists of Florida, visit our website at atheistofflorida.com. Continue the discussion on our website, talk.aof.ngo. And join us again next Friday for another edition of the Atheist Forum here on Tan Talk 1340.
Yes, we did. Very good. Glad to have you.
You've been had.
WTAN, Clearwater,
FM 106.1,
WDCF, Dade City, Tampa Bay, WZHR, Zephyr Hills.
FM 104.3.
Listen.
Climate change. Shoppers spend. I'm Mike Lewis. A massive new federal report warns that extreme weather disasters like California's wildfires and this year's hurricanes are worsening in the United States. Correspondent Renee Marsh.
Wildfires, which we're seeing out west. They say if this is not brought under control, wildfire season will burn up to 6 times